The cold was a promise the land made in October and kept until May. It was a thief, stealing the warmth from a man's breath, the life from a stray calf, the memory of summer from the very bones of the earth. For Jedediah Thorne, the cold was a penance. He had chosen this high, solitary valley in the Colorado Territory precisely for its unforgiving nature. It was a place where a man could be scoured clean by wind and winter, where the silence was so profound it could swallow a scream whole. He was checking his trap lines along the skeletal fingers of Ashfall Creek, the water choked with ice that looked like shattered bone. The sun was a weak, indifferent coin in a slate-gray sky. A dusting of new snow covered the world in a brittle white shroud, recording the passage of every creature. He saw the tracks of a coyote, the delicate stitching of a field mouse, and then a smear, a long, ugly furrow in the perfect snow, stained with a crimson so dark it was almost black. It was not the track of an animal. It was the track of something. Dragging itself, dying, Jedediah's hand went to the stock of the Winchester leaning against a frost-split pine. His first thought was of a wounded wolf, or perhaps a mountain cat, cornered and dangerous. He followed the trail with a caution that had been etched into his soul by years of solitude, and the 1 year of chaos that had preceded them, the furrow. Led away from the creek, toward a small, protected copse of aspen, their white bark like the ribs of forgotten beasts. There, slumped against the pale trunk of the largest tree, was the source. Not a beast. A person. Small, wrapped in a tattered blanket, and inexplicably, a Union cavalry coat, the blue fabric dark with moisture and blood. It was a child, he thought at first. The size was that of a boy of 10 or 12. But as he drew closer, the cold air stinging his lungs, he saw the long black hair, matted with snow and blood, and the delicate, high-boned face turned toward the frozen ground. An Apache girl. His heart seized, a cold fist clamping around it that had nothing to do with the winter air. An Apache. Here, miles from any known territory. Deep in a valley the Utes claimed and the white men were steadily encroaching upon. To be found here, wounded, was a death sentence. To be found by him was something worse, a judgment. He knelt, the snow crunching under his knee. The girl's breathing was a faint, shallow rattle, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. A deep gash, ugly and puckered, ran along her hairline, the blood frozen into a dark crust, but the real damage was hidden. The way she was curled, the deep, seeping stain that had melted the snow beneath her side. It was a gut wound. A bullet. Most likely, he knew what he should do. The law of the valley, the unwritten code of survival, was clear. He should turn around, walk away, forget what he saw. To touch her was to invite a war he could not win. To bring her into his home was to paint a target on his own door. Her people, if they were near, would follow her trail. They would find his cabin. They would not ask questions. And the other side, the white settlers and prospectors trickling into the lower valleys, would see him as a traitor, an Indian lover, a man who had chosen the wrong side in a battle that had no right side. He remained kneeling, the cold seeping through his buckskin trousers. He looked at her face, half buried in the snow. Her skin was the color of fired earth, her eyelashes a delicate, frozen fringe. He saw the ghost of another face then, a smaller one, with eyes the color of a summer sky and hair like spun corn. His own daughter, taken by the fever 3 winters ago, her breath rattling in the same terrible way. He had been helpless then, a man of strength and action reduced to watching life flicker and die like a cheap candle. The silence of the high valley pressed in on him. The only sound was the faint, ghostly whisper of the wind through the pines and the dying girl's breath. He looked up at the ridge overlooking the creek, the same ridge he stared at every morning with his coffee, the ridge that had witnessed his shame. He had sat a horse up there once, in a different life, in a blue coat like the one she wore, and watched smoke rise from a village that should have been left in peace. He had done nothing then. He had turned his face away. He could not do it. Again, to hell with the consequences, to hell with the fear, to hell with the silence that was really just a long, slow surrender. Gently, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle even the spirit of the dying girl, he slid his arms. Beneath her, she was lighter than he expected, a bundle of frail bones and soaked wool. As he lifted her, her head lolled back against his chest. Her eyes fluttered open, not seeing him, but seeing something far away. They were black, bottomless, like pools of night. Her lips, cracked and blue with cold, parted. A single word escaped, not a plea, not a cry, but a statement, a whisper of sound that the wind seemed to catch and hold. Jill. The word was foreign to his tongue, but he felt its weight. It was ancient and heavy, like a stone worn smooth by a river. Then her eyes closed and she was limp in his arms. A lone hawk cried out from the vast, empty sky, its voice. Sharp and piercing, it sounded like a verdict. Jedediah stood, the girl held tight against his chest, and began the long, slow walk back to his cabin. Each footstep a choice, each crunch of snow a seal on his fate. He was no longer just a man in exile. He was a man carrying a reckoning. The cabin was one room, built of sturdy pine he had felled and squared himself. It was a place of monastic simplicity, a stone hearth, a narrow cot, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and loneliness. He laid the Apache girl on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire world he now inhabited. Her stillness was terrifying. She seemed less like a living person and more like an effigy, a sacred object left in his care. He worked with a grim, focused intensity, the way a man does when the task is not just about a body, but about a soul, his own. First, he peeled away the sodden, frozen layers. The blanket was coarse, woven with geometric patterns he didn't recognize. Beneath it was the cavalry coat. As he unbuttoned it, the brass buttons cold against his calloused fingers, a wave of nausea washed over him. It was a sergeant's coat, the 3rd Cavalry, his old unit. He stared at it, the dark blue wool stained with the girl's blood. It felt like an accusation. He remembered the smell of those coats, sweat, horse, leather, and the faint, acrid tang of gunpowder. He remembered the weight of it on his own shoulders. He had burned his own uniform in a feverish ritual the day he'd arrived in this valley, hoping to burn the memories with it. And now here it was again, clinging to the broken body of one of the people it had been used to hunt. He balled it up, his knuckles white, and shoved it deep into a wooden chest in the corner, a coffin for a life he had tried to bury. He would deal with it later. Burn it, send it to the bottom of the frozen creek. He turned back to the girl. Beneath the coat, she wore a simple doeskin dress, stitched with porcupine quills. It was torn near her side, where the bullet had gone in. Gently, he cut the fabric away, his hand surprisingly steady. The wound was worse than he'd feared. It was low on her abdomen, angry and inflamed, the edges raw. He had seen enough bullet wounds to know it had likely torn through something vital. Without a surgeon, without proper medicine, her chances were less than 0. But he had to try. He was not a doctor, but his late wife Elora had been a woman of the earth, a believer in root and leaf. He still had her small collection of dried herbs, kept in tins on a shelf above the hearth. He boiled water, his movements practiced and methodical. He washed the wound with a decoction of yarrow to staunch the bleeding, and willow bark for the pain. The girl did not stir. Her fever was climbing. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin. For 2 days the cabin became a crucible of silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the hiss of melting snow in the kettle, and the girl's ragged, whisper-thin breaths. He did not sleep. He sat in the chair by the cot, watching her, his mind a maelstrom of past and present. He was no hero. He was a coward. That was the truth he had come here to live with. He had joined the cavalry not for glory, but for a steady wage, a way to feed Elora and their little Sarah. He had been a good soldier, followed orders, kept his rifle clean. And then came the campaign into the territories, the rhetoric of savages, and manifest destiny that turned good men into monsters. The massacre at Red Willow Canyon hadn't been a battle. It had been an extermination. Women, children, old men, butchered in their lodges while their warriors were away on a hunt. He had been on the ridge with the reserve company, a spectator to hell. He hadn't fired a shot. But he hadn't stopped it either. He had sat his horse, frozen, while the captain, a man with eyes like chips of flint, had screamed, "Leave none." Alive, Jedediah had watched, and a part of him had died there on that dusty ridge. He saw a woman trying to shield her child, cut down by a saber. He saw an old man walking out with his hands raised in peace, shot in the chest. That night he had deserted. He hadn't just left the army. He had left the world, taking his wife and daughter with him, seeking a place so remote that the echoes of those screams could not reach him. But the fever had found them anyway, and now he was truly alone, haunted not by righteousness, but by the profound shame of his own inaction. And now, this girl, an Apache, a ghost from the very people he had watched being slaughtered. She was a ghost in his house. She would not speak even when her fever broke on the third day, and her eyes opened, clear and lucid. They were ancient eyes. They followed his every move, but they held no fear. They held a stillness, a depth that unnerved him. She refused the broth he offered, but she would drink water, sipping it slowly from a tin cup he held to her lips. Her silence was louder than any accusation. It filled the small cabin, pressing in on him. It was the silence of mountains, of stones, of things that have witnessed too much to speak. He would sit by the fire, mending a harness or sharpening a blade, and feel her gaze on him, a physical weight. She would stare into the flames for hours, her expression unreadable. Did she see warmth? Or did she see the fire that had consumed her family, her village, her world? One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, piling snow against the door, he saw something that made the hair on his arms stand up. On her left wrist, peeking from beneath the sleeve of the oversized shirt he had dressed her in, were scars. They were not from violence. They were thin, white, and deliberate, arranged in a pattern like the rays of a rising sun. They were ritual scars, marks of passage, of pain willingly endured. This was not just a lost child. She was someone. He felt like a profane thing in a sacred space. He, Jedediah Thorne, the deserter, the coward, sharing his roof with this silent, scarred girl who carried the weight of her entire people in her gaze. They were two wounds under one roof, two ghosts trapped in the snowbound cabin, each haunted by a different fire. The silence between them was not empty. It was a chasm filled with the unspoken histories of two worlds locked in a death grip. And in that chasm, something terrible and holy was beginning to take root. The days bled into a week, then two. The world outside remained a frozen, white expanse. Inside the cabin, a fragile, unspoken truce took hold. He tended to her wound, which, against all odds, did not fester. It began to close, knitting itself together with a stubborn will to live that awed him. He learned her rhythms. She would wake with the first hint of gray light, her eyes already open, watching the window. She would accept water, and eventually, small bites of dried venison softened in broth. He found himself talking to her, filling the immense silence with the gravel of his own voice. He didn't speak of the war or of his shame. He spoke of his wife, Elora. She would have known what to do with you, he murmured one afternoon, changing the dressing on her wound. The girl's eyes were fixed on his face, her expression placid. She knew all the plants. called them by their secret names, said a prayer before she picked a single leaf. She'd have had you up and dancing in a week. He told her about their daughter Sarah, how she used to chase butterflies in the meadow below the cabin, her laughter like the sound of tiny bells. He spoke of the songs Elora used to sing, old ballads from a land across the sea, songs of lost love and green hills he'd never seen. One evening, his voice hoarse with disuse and memory, he hummed one of them. It was a simple, melancholy tune. The girl, Taliana, he had started calling her that in his own mind, a name that felt like it had the whisper of wind and the strength of stone in it, did not react. But a few hours later, as the fire burned low and the cabin was filled with dancing shadows, he heard a sound. It was a low, guttural hum, rising from the cot. It was not his song. It was a chant, a series of notes that seemed to rise from the very earth. It was hypnotic, repetitive, and filled with a sorrow so deep it felt geological. He sat frozen in his chair, not daring to move. She was humming to the shadows, to the embers, to the spirits that filled the corners of the room. He realized with a jolt that the song was not for him. It was for someone else, someone she knew was listening. The next morning, she was stronger. She sat up on her own, her back straight, her black eyes holding a new, focused intensity. She pointed a slender finger toward the hearth, where the ashes from the previous night's fire lay cool and gray. Jedediah understood. He took a small burnt stick from the woodpile and handed it to her. She didn't use it. Instead, she dipped her fingers into the soft gray ash and began to draw on the smooth, flat hearthstone. Her fingers moved with a strange, fluid grace. She drew a mountain, a sharp, powerful peak, Jill, the word she had whispered in the snow. Then she drew a circle around it, and from the circle, she drew a single wavering line that snaked across the stone until it touched a small, crude square he recognized as his cabin. Then she looked up at him. Her eyes were not the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of a seer. A profound dread, cold and sharp, pierced through the fragile peace of the cabin. She had not been running from danger. She had been on a journey that ended here. That afternoon, he went to the chest in the corner and pulled out the cavalry sergeant's coat. He couldn't have it in the house any longer. It was a sickness, a poison. He took it outside, the winter air a slap to his face. He walked 100 yards from the cabin, dug a deep hole in the snow and the hard earth beneath, and buried it. He said no words, he performed no rites. He just covered it with frozen dirt and snow, hoping to bury the part of himself that it represented. As he turned to walk back, he saw her standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching him. Her expression was unchanged, but he knew she had seen, she had understood. The quiet that followed was different. It was no longer the quiet of healing. It was the quiet of a held breath, the quiet before the lightning strike. The air in the cabin grew thick with anticipation. It felt like a dream, the kind that is so vivid and beautiful, you know it must end in a fall. He was tending to a wound, yes, but he was also nurturing a prophecy, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his marrow, that he was not the keeper of this story. He was merely a chapter in it, and that chapter was about to end. The coming was not announced with a war cry or the thunder of hooves. It began with a change in the silence. It was the hour before dawn, a time of absolute stillness when the Fenzent world is caught between the black of night and the gray of morning. Jedediah was awake, as he always was, sitting by the dying embers of the fire. A sense of profound wrongness had pulled him from a shallow, restless sleep. It was a pressure in the air, a weight on the land. The familiar night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the distant cry of a fox had ceased. The world had gone mute. He rose and went to the single window, wiping the condensation from the glass. The landscape was awash in the ethereal, pre-dawn light, the snow glowing with a faint blue luminescence. At first, he saw nothing, just the skeletal trees and the long, deep shadows. Then, his eyes adjusted. On the ridge, a silhouette. A man on a horse, as still as an equestrian statue. He was a black cutout against the bruised purple of the sky. Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the suffocating silence. He had known this was coming. He had invited it. But the reality of it was a cold dread that slicked his palms with sweat. He watched, unmoving, as another figure materialized beside the first. Then another. And another. They did not ride over the crest. They simply appeared, emerging from the fog in the gloaming like spirits given form. 10, 20, 50. They fanned out along the ridge, a silent, watching crescent of mounted men, their forms stark and menacing in the growing light. They held rifles, but they did not raise them. Their power was not in their weapons, it was in their presence. Their collective gaze was a physical force, pressing down on the small cabin, pinning it to the earth. Jedediah turned from the window. The girl was sitting up on the cot. She was not afraid. Her face was calm, her hands folded in her lap. She was waiting. She had been waiting all along. The front door of the cabin creaked open on its leather hinges. He hadn't heard anyone approach. A man stood there, framed in the doorway. He was not one of the riders from the ridge. He was on foot, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose age was impossible to guess. His face was a mask of hard-won lines and deep-set wisdom, his long gray-streaked hair held back by a simple leather band. He wore a buffalo hide robe, and his presence filled the small room, diminishing it. Beside him, his hand resting on the man's shoulder, stood a young boy of about 14, his eyes holding the same fierce stillness as the man's. This was their chief. To come on foot was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of immense gravity. Behind them, the world was filling with people. Not just the warriors from the ridge, but women, children, old ones. They came on foot, emerging from the trees, their moccasins making no sound on the snow. They did not stop at a distance. They walked until they formed a dense, silent circle around the cabin, 200 strong, their faces patient, implacable. The land had gone quiet because they were the land. Their heartbeats were the thunder that had been missing. The chiefs, eyes black and piercing, scanned the room. They passed over Jedediah as if he were a piece of furniture and settled on the girl. A flicker of something relief, reverence passed through them. He said her name, a name Jedediah had never heard, a sound like wind through reeds. Taliana. So he had been right. The girl slid off the cot, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She walked toward the chief, her back straight, her head held high. She stopped before him and bowed her head. The chief placed a hand on her hair. Then, his gaze turned to Jedediah. It was a gaze that held the weight of centuries of broken promises, of stolen land, of slaughtered kin. It was the gaze of judgment. The chief spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried the authority of a landslide. The English was heavily accented, but the words were honed to a razor's edge. You have a thing that is not yours. It was not a question. Jedediah felt the cabin shrink around him, the air growing thin. He knew there were no words he could offer that would matter. Explanations were the currency of the white man, a way to excuse and diminish. Here, there was only the act itself, stark and undeniable. He walked out of his own door, into the center of the silent, watching circle of Apache faces. The cold was biting, but he didn't feel it. He felt the heat of 200 pairs of eyes. He saw the weathered faces of the women, the curious and fearful eyes of the children, the hard, unforgiving stares of the warriors. He was an island in a sea of history, and the tide was coming in. He looked at the chief, Nantanlupan, as the chief boy beside him had called him. He saw no path to survival. He did not ask for one. He had made his choice at the frozen creek. This was the cost. And then the chief spoke the words that sealed the world, the words that were both an accusation and a key. You touched one of ours. Jedediah Thorne, the man who had run from his past, who had hidden in the silence, who had refused to kneel before God or government, slowly, deliberately, dropped to one knee in the snow. He bowed his head, not in fear, but in a final crushing act of atonement. The world held its breath. He waited for the blow, for the blade, for the bullet. Instead, he felt a touch. It was small, light, and warm against the cold air. Taliana, the girl, had walked to his side. She placed her hand on his bowed head. It was not a gesture of forgiveness nor of condemnation. It was a claiming, a marking. And in that moment, Jedediah knew his life was no longer his own. They did not kill him. They did not bind him. They took him. Nathan Lupin gestured with his chin, a silent command. Two warriors stepped forward, their faces impassive stone. They flanked Jedediah, their presence a cage more effective than any rope. He rose from the snow, his knee aching with cold, and walked where they guided him. The entire tribe turned and began to move as one, a silent flowing river of people, swallowing him in their current. He was led through the throng, past the women who pulled their children closer, their dark eyes following him with a mixture of suspicion and awe. He saw the girl, Taliana, walking beside the chief, her hand now holding his. The journey was not long, perhaps 2 miles into a hidden box canyon he had never known existed. It was a natural fortress, sheltered from the wind, with a small, clear spring bubbling up from the earth. A temporary village had been erected, a collection of hide wickiups, the smoke from their fires rising straight into the cold, still air. This was her tribe, the Chiricahua, the great mountain people. They led him to the center of the encampment. Before a large, ceremonial fire that had already been lit, its flames licking hungrily at the gray sky. There, they bade him to stand, a solitary white figure in a world of brown skin and black hair. The entire tribe gathered, forming a great, silent circle around the fire. The air was electric with unspoken meaning. Nathan Lupin stood before him. In his hands, he held something that made Jedediah's blood turn to ice. It was the blue cavalry sergeant's coat. One of the warriors must have dug it up after he had gone with them. They had known all along. This coat, the chief began, his voice echoing in the sudden profound silence of the canyon. This coat belonged to the man who led the soldiers at Red Willow Canyon, the one they called the Butcher. Jedediah's breath hitched in his throat. So, it was true. This was the very heart of his shame, laid bare before the people he had wronged. Nathan Lupin continued, his eyes locked on Jedediah's. The Butcher did not survive that day. My own brother, a great warrior, took his life. He wore this coat for a time, as a sign of his victory, before he too fell. He let the words hang in the air, a testament to the endless cycle of violence. Then he looked at Jedediah, his gaze sharpening. You were there. On the ridge. We had scouts in the high rocks. They saw everything. They saw a soldier who sat his horse and did not raise his rifle. A soldier who turned his face away, as if in shame. It was not a question. It was a statement that stripped him bare. There was nowhere left to hide. Yes, Jedediah said, his voice a raw croak. I was there, I watched, and I did nothing. He finally said the words aloud, the poison he had held in his heart for years. He expected a roar of anger, a call for his blood. Instead, there was only the sound of the crackling fire and the wind whispering along the canyon walls. He had expected to be the defendant in this trial. He had not understood that he was merely a witness. The true subject was the girl. Nathan Lupin turned to Taliana, who stood beside him, her small form radiating an impossible authority. This child is not of my blood, the chief announced to his people. She is the last of the Willow Creek band, the only one to escape the soldiers' slaughter. She is an orphan. But she is not lost. She is Izzy Gesh, a dream walker. The spirits have touched her. For 2 winters, she has been in a trance, speaking of a vision. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle upon the crowd. She saw a man on a ridge, a soldier with a ghost's face. She saw him turn away from the killing. The spirits told her this man carried a seed of a different path. They told her he carried a sickness of the soul for what he had seen. They commanded her to find him, not as a warrior seeking vengeance, but as a healer seeks a wound. Her journey was not a flight from death. It was a sacred quest to a flicker of life in a dead man's heart. Jedediah stared, his mind reeling. The girl finding him hadn't been an accident. Her wound, the snow, his choice, it was all a tapestry woven by hands he could not see. His deepest shame, the act of cowardice he had hidden from the world, had been seen, and it had not been interpreted as weakness, but as something else, a divergence, a possibility. Taliana had not stumbled upon him by chance. She had been sent. She had followed a spiritual map, a vision that led through snow and blood and pain, directly to his door. He hadn't saved her. In a way that defied all logic, she had come to save him. He felt the foundations of his world crumble. He, the deserter. The failure had been a destination, a linchpin in a prophecy he never knew existed. His guilt was real, his inaction was real, but the story was so much larger than he could have ever comprehended. It was not just about him and his pathetic. So, it was about them. About a vision of a different way forward. A way that did not involve endless cycles of revenge, but an act of incomprehensible ancestral grace. He looked at Taliana. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not a child, not a victim, but a formidable power, an ancient wisdom residing in a young girl's body. She had seen him, truly seen him, across miles and years, and had walked into the jaws of death to find the one man who would understand the weight of her silence. The great fire roared, casting a flickering, primal light onto the stoic faces of the Chiricahua. The drums began. It was a slow, deep, resonant beat, the very heartbeat of the canyon. It was a sound that spoke of time itself, of rock and wind, and generations of life and death held in this sacred, hidden place. Jedediah stood, a man unmoored from his own history, watching as 2 women came forward. They were elders, their faces beautiful maps of wrinkles, their hands gnarled but steady. They approached Taliana. Using brushes made from yucca fiber, they began to paint her. They painted her face with white clay, the color of spirits and new beginnings. They drew a sun on her forehead and lightning bolts down her arms. He watched the solemn preparation with a growing sense of dread. He saw it through the lens of his own culture, through stories of sacrifice and blood rites. The fire, the drums, the ritual painting, it felt like a prelude to a funeral. He thought they were purifying her, preparing her spirit for its final journey, a rite of passage into death for the last of her clan. Perhaps her wound, though closing, was deemed insurmountable, her survival a violation of the natural order. After the massacre of her people, as she was led toward the roaring fire, her small white-painted form looking fragile and ethereal, a protective instinct, fierce and irrational, surged through him. He had not brought her this far, only to watch her be consumed by some ritual he could not comprehend. No, the word tore from his throat, raw and desperate. He took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. Whatever debt I owe, let me pay it, not her. Take me. The 2 warriors who flanked him instantly seized his arms, their grips like iron. The drumming stopped. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the hiss and crackle of the flames. Every eye in the canyon was on him. Nanton Lupin turned, his expression not of anger, but of a profound, weary patience. the look of a man explaining the nature of the sky to a blind man. "You still do not understand, white man," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the circle. "You see with the eyes of a conqueror. You see death everywhere. This is not a death rite. This is a naming, a beginning." He gestured to Taliana, who now stood at the edge of the firelight, radiant and unafraid. Her vision is complete. She has found the man who turned his face from death. She has brought his spirit to our fire.
The child who was low, saint in the snow, is no more. Tonight, she has given her true name, a name that will carry the story of this moment for all generations to come. Jedediah stood speechless, the warrior's grip loosening on his arms. A naming, not a funeral, a birth. He looked at the fire, at the girl, at the faces of the people, and saw it all differently. This was not about an ending. It was about the stubborn, defiant continuation of life. It was a ceremony of survival. Then, the full weight of his despair, his guilt, crashed down on him. He had survived. They were offering life, but he did not deserve it. "Punish me," he whispered, his voice breaking. He fell to his knees again, not from command, but from the sheer weight of his own soul. "I beg you, I am not a man of peace. I wore the blue coat. I stood on that ridge. I let your people die. I deserved nothing but the death I fled from." Nantan Lupan walked over to him, standing above him as Jedediah knelt in the dirt and dust of the canyon floor. The chief's shadow fell over him. "We will not give you the peace of a quick death," the chief said, his voice softening with something that sounded almost like pity. "Your punishment is not to die. Your punishment is to live with the memory you have tried so hard to bury. You will not be allowed to forget." He then raised his voice, addressing his people. "This man came to our lands in the uniform of our enemies, but he did not act as they did. He buried the coat of the butcher. He gave water and shelter to one of our own. He knelt before our judgment. He offered his life for a child's. The spirits have seen this. We have seen this." He looked down at Jedediah. "We will not call you by the name the White Eyes gave you. That name is for a man who is dead. From this day forward, you will have a new name among us, a name that will remind you every day of your debt and of your choice." He placed his hand on Jedediah's shoulder, the weight of it both a burden and a strange comfort. "We will call you Ndeo Gai Biuhozo, he who makes peace with the ghost." The name settled over Jedediah not like a crown, but like a shroud for the man he had been, and a swaddling for the man he was forced now to become. He was being offered not forgiveness, but something far more profound and difficult, a purpose. Taliana, her face a radiant mask of white clay, walked to the fire. She raised her hands to the sky and spoke her new name to the stars, a name that was hers alone, a secret between her, her people, and the spirits who had guided her. The drums began again, stronger this time, a joyous, powerful rhythm that echoed off the canyon walls, a celebration of a story that had not ended in blood, but had been reborn in fire. He did not leave. He could not. To return to his cabin would be to return to a life that no longer fit him, like a snake trying to crawl back into a skin it had already shed. The name they had given him, Ndeo Gai Biuhozo, was a tether, binding him to this canyon, to these people, to the girl whose vision had rewritten his existence. He did not become one of them. He was not a warrior. He did not hunt with their hunting parties or sit in their councils of war. He was other, and they allowed him to be. His role was quieter, more solitary. He became a guardian, a watcher on the periphery. He moved his few belongings, his tools, his blankets, Elora's tins of herbs, from his cabin to a small, isolated wickiup on the edge of the encampment, close enough to be part of their world, but separate enough to honor the chasm that would always exist between his past and their present. His life became a series of quiet, deliberate acts. He repaired tools, mended leather, tended to the sick with the simple remedies Alora had taught him, knowledge that the Apache medicine men observed with a quiet, professional curiosity. He taught the young boy who had stood beside Nantan Lupan how to track deer in the snow, a skill he knew from his years of solitude, and he watched over Taliana. She was no longer the silent, wounded girl from the cabin. With her new name, she had blossomed. She was revered, a child who walked with spirits, her wisdom sought by elders, yet she remained a child. He would see her playing with the other children, her laughter echoing in the canyon, and the sound would be a balm on the raw, scarred parts of his soul. She would often come to his wickiup and simply sit with him in the comfortable silence they had first forged in his cabin. She never spoke of her vision again. She did not need to. They were living it. He was the ghost she had made peace with, a living embodiment of a past that could be acknowledged without being repeated. His punishment, as Nantan Lupan had decreed, was to live. And in living he began slowly, painfully, to heal. The screams from Red Willow Canyon did not vanish, but they grew fainter, replaced by the sounds of the camp, the drums, the laughter, the murmur of the Ende language, a language he began to understand not through lessons, but through listening. He was a bridge, a strange, solitary bridge built of shame and unforeseen grace. He was a living reminder that not all members of the encroaching race were the same, a difficult and complicated truth that the tribe held in a delicate, cautious balance. One evening, years later, he sat with Nantan Lupan by the chief's fire. Taliana, now a young woman on the cusp of her own life, sat between them, her presence a quiet blessing. The years had deepened the lines on the chief's face and silvered Jedediah's hair. An easy silence rested between the two men, a silence forged by shared winters and mutual respect. A new threat was on the horizon, whispers of more soldiers, of treaties that were promises of betrayal, of a world that was shrinking around the Chiricahua. The future was uncertain, a gathering storm. Nantan Lupan looked into the fire, his old eyes seeing things in the flames that Jedediah could not. "The path ahead is dark," the chief said, his voice a low rumble. "The ghost you carry may yet have to fight other ghosts." Jedediah nodded. He knew his peace was conditional, his life a reprieve, not a pardon. He might die here, defending this canyon, this family he had been given instead of the one he had lost. Or he might live to see it all swept away. It did not matter. He had found his place. He was no longer a man running from his past, but a man standing guard over a fragile future. He looked at Taliana, at the strength and grace in her face. She was the vision. She was the hope. He had been the vessel, the unlikely tool to bring her into her power. His life had been a long, wandering sentence. Here, in this hidden canyon, among the people his kind had tried to erase, he had finally found the period at the end of it. Or perhaps the first word of a new one. High on the canyon wall, painted in ochre beside the faded images of bison and hunters from generations past, a new pictograph had been added. It showed a small girl leading a tall, faceless man toward a circle of people. A story for the ages, its meaning known only to those who had witnessed it. A testament to a single, inexplicable act of mercy that had altered the course of a soul and a nation. A whisper to the fire, a truth carved in stone. He gave what the others never did, time and blood and silence.